Records shattered across Europe. A wave of warm weather has swept the continent. It's a short-term respite for governments struggling with high energy prices, but the long-term effects could be catastrophic. I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Europe's warmest winter. Temperatures in 8 countries across Europe have broken national records this year. At 25 degrees Celsius, New Year's Day temps in Bilbao, Spain, were the equivalent to an average July summer day. But for those thinking a balmy winter sounds pleasant, think again. The world has already warmed by about 1.2 degrees Celsius since the industrial era began, and temperatures will likely keep rising. The glaciers that support ski resorts in winter and attract climbers in the summer are also essential to Europe's water supply. Switzerland's glaciers alone have lost more than half their volume in less than a century. And the long, hot summer last year accelerated that thaw. In Chamonix, France, there has been far below average snowfall, and snow cannons are sitting idle because there's not enough water to fuel them. In Switzerland, some resorts have simply shut down their ski lifts indefinitely. And in Bosnia, it's been a very challenging start to the year.
Bookings are sharply reduced, and this is forcing us to lower our prices and cut down the number of staff. So business is very tough and uncertain. We expect help from the authorities at local and regional levels. We spoke with the tourist board representatives. They agreed that it was impossible to recall a season like this and promised to look for ways to help us, including by declaring a state of natural emergency in ski resorts and other winter tourism sites. We will see. We are hoping for snow to salvage what we can of this winter season.
Well, this warmer weather has far-reaching effects far beyond lost tourism revenue. Many European sectors could face severe problems later in the year.
Low snowfall comes on the back of a drier than normal 2022, meaning hydropower production could fall well below normal in several countries. Europe's farmers will also be affected by the lack of snow this winter. Snow cover protects dormant winter crops against cold snaps that kill plants before they have had the time to fully develop in the spring. And spring-related crops that rely on snowmelt to provide crucial soil moisture for the start of the season will also suffer. Low snow totals and above normal temperatures also pose a risk to Europe's river systems. These are vital trade arteries used to move grain, fuel, and finished goods. Further drops in river levels may snarl Europe's key logistics channels for a second straight year. And rivers also provide critical cooling water for several nuclear reactors, especially in top nuclear power producer France. If snow totals remain well below usual, river temperatures may stay warmer than normal in 2023. If nuclear power output is curtailed again, European utilities may be forced to burn more fossil fuels to generate power instead, producing additional emissions. So while the mild weather is being viewed by some as having prevented a deeper power crisis, the low snow and rain totals could cause even greater crises in the months to come.
Now, in spite of so many warnings, the global heating outlook keeps getting worse. So can we realistically change that? Well, joining me now to debate that and more are, from Exeter, UK, Associate Professor in Earth System Science at the University of Exeter and author of Firestorm and Flood, The Violence of Climate Change, James Dyke. Also in the UK, in Rockland St. Mary, former spokesperson for Extinction Rebellion and co-director of Moderate Flank Incubator, Rupert Read. And from Perth, Australia, Professor of Sustainability at Curtin University and coordinating lead author for the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Peter Newman. Thanks all so much for being with us. You know, we run the risk of sounding like a broken record here because we keep going over a lot of the same territory as more proof arises that global warming is real and it's putting us in serious danger. James, for 8 years now, temperature records have been broken and broken again. But when we see no snow in the Alps in January, can we say this is the proverbial point of no return?
Probably not, I'm sorry to say. There's going to be future points of no return. In fact, just this week, a new report has been published which has demonstrated that if we continue to burn fossil fuels, if we continue to drive global warming, we are at increasing risk of activating a number of tipping points or tipping elements in the climate system. And the risk there is not only will we not see snow in the Alps in some winters, but we could actually change the functioning of the climate system itself. So we might see the permanent and irreversible loss of ice sheets, not just in the Alps, but in Greenland, in Arctic, in Antarctica. And these have got potentially global impacts. And once these processes start, even if we come to our collective senses and decide to stop burning coal, oil and gas, it really will be too late. And we are becoming perilously near these kind of tipping elements.
Right. I mean, when you talk about the melting of Greenland, for example, and the global implications that has, you're talking about mostly rising sea levels, correct?
That's the initial cause for concern. So if we were to lose significant fractions of the Greenland or elements of the western Antarctic ice sheet, we are looking at not just meters, but many tens of meters of sea level rise. Now, the good news is, hopefully, that will take a very, very long time to happen. We're talking maybe timescales of centuries, perhaps even over 1,000 years. But because it will be producing large amounts of fresh water, particularly in Greenland, it's understood to be affecting the Atlantic circulation. So what this means is that as we begin to lose one tipping element or tipping point, say, for example, the loss of large amounts of ice in Greenland, that begins to affect the Atlantic currents. And the Atlantic currents are really important for Europe, and actually globally, because they transport vast amounts of energy up from the hot tropics. If that starts to slow down, if that starts to get destabilized, then what was an initial tipping element in one aspect of the climate system produces effects somewhere else. And then we're seeing large-scale impacts in Europe, in tropical regions, and then within a relatively short period of time, up to a global scale. So what we need to bear in mind here is these things are interconnected, and we're still trying to work out what those interconnections actually are.
Right. Rupert, I mean, going to what James said about I mean, potentially something that's, comes as a slight relief in his analysis is that this could actually happen quite slowly over centuries to come. So we're not in necessarily immediate danger. I mean, do you take any consolation in hearing that?
No. And the reason is that what James said very clearly is that the sea level rise element take a very long time, but that tragically, there are other elements of what's happening which are on much shorter timescales. I'm really scared about this massive disruption to our weather, which has caused you to have this program. Temperature records this winter are being broken by 2, 3, 4, 5 degrees. That never happens. When temperature records go down by that kind of amount, it shows you that the system is really badly out of kilter. We notice this, of course, a lot more in summer than in winter, because in summer we then reach new extreme highs of temperature, whereas in winter, all it means is that it feels relatively mild. But make no mistake, this winter heat wave, and of course it's being devastating in the global south where it's summer, for example, in Australia, this winter heat wave is really, really terrifying. And when I speak to younger audiences, for example, about this, I have barely the heart to tell them what this means, because what it means on far shorter timescales than the timescales that are going to affect our sea levels, is it means massive disruption in weather, and that means potentially massive disruption in real basics like food and water. So what I'm really worried about, and what is really hard to investigate, but what we need to be putting a lot more effort into investigating and preparing for, is the potential devastation to our food systems, which is going to occur, could be as soon as the next decade.
Okay, Peter, I mean, so these extremes we're now seeing in the temperatures in Europe, they're not an anomaly. As Rupert is explaining, these really are symbolic of much worse to come, even affecting fundamentally our food supplies. Is it that bad?
Well, the interesting thing is to see at the same time as this extreme is happening in Europe, we are having atmospheric rivers hitting California in ways that are unrecorded. Up and down that coast, causing massive flooding and mudslides that are ripping the trees out in cities and coastline areas all the way along that coast. And it is unprecedented. In my own country, not far from where I live, in the north, there has been an extraordinary dropping of rain. We didn't call it an atmospheric river, but it was a cyclone that shouldn't have been there, and it has caused a river to become 50 kilometres wide. That's pretty hard to imagine, and certainly nothing seen before. So you do have these unprecedented events happening. When I first started in IPCC 10 years ago, we were talking about the potential to cause major extreme events, but we weren't really seeing them yet. And people would write about the possibility, and it suddenly started happening. And in the last few years, it's just accelerating. So it is happening, and it is getting out of hand.
Right.
So we seriously need to do things.
Okay, I mean, Peter, for as the lack of optimism I'm hearing from you in your tone runs a bit contrary to the confidence you actually do have in the IPCC's reports that give us these guidelines to tell us how we can somehow get this under control. Explain why you still have some of that optimism that there is a way to manage this going forward.
Yeah, I was at COP27, and I think the highlight for me was Al Gore. And he said two things. Firstly, just to imagine the amount of energy that is in 8 Hiroshima bombs going off every day. That is what we're putting in the atmosphere. That's very scary. But he followed it immediately by saying, as soon as we stop putting fossil fuels into the atmosphere, the burning of them, and as we begin to decline in the amount of CO2 that we're putting out there, we will begin to see changes, and they will happen very quickly. So we can begin to reverse things if we get going quickly. And the breakthrough that he showed, and which is in the IPCC reports, is that solar, wind, batteries and electric vehicles, so as a whole, are now cheaper than any other form of new development that you can do. So it is an opportunity that is now there, that it is not going to damage the economy. What's going to damage the economy is if we don't get going.
Right. James, you know, we've heard talk about dramatic changes to our consumer behavior, especially being necessary to cut greenhouse gas emissions along the lines that the IPCC has laid out. The problem is, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, because I have never gotten a clear enough explanation for this. When we did see during the pandemic, for example, almost a complete halt to our industrial activity, those industrial pollutants, no one was driving, no one was flying. It didn't even make a dent, really, in curbing climate change in any way. So tell me how you see it possible that some of these guidelines and restrictions can actually make a difference going forward.
Yeah, the COVID example is a really good one, because during the depths of the lockdown, we might have seen an annual reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by maybe up to 10%. And that's the kind of annual rate of reduction that we're going to need to reproduce over the next few decades in order for us to be able to stop emitting any significant amounts of carbon dioxide by the middle of this century. And we think we need to do that in order to have a decent chance of limiting warming to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. What we need to understand is until we stop burning coal, oil and gas, and until we stop producing greenhouse gases, temperatures will rise. Obviously, the more greenhouse gases we produce, the faster that rise will be. So even though there was a reduction in the total amount of emissions at the depths of those COVID lockdowns, because we were still emitting carbon dioxide, concentrations of CO2 were still going up, temperatures were still going up. It's like turning around a massive supertanker. Now, when you look at it at this kind of planetary scale, it does look insurmountable. It looks as if there are no possible ways that we're going to be able to turn this thing around in time. But there is some good news. And the good news, I think, is that most of the greenhouse gas emissions, most of the carbon dioxide comes from a relatively small fraction of the Earth's population. And that's essentially the richest people. Of course, the bad news is those richest people tend to be the most powerful people, and they have thus proved to be the most resistant to change. We're also talking about the major fossil fuel companies who risk oblivion. I mean, they risk walking away from trillions of dollars of assets in terms of stranded assets, coal,
Right.
oil and gas that we cannot
And as
burn.
you say that,
So
James,
on
I'm
the one
sorry,
hand,
I
we've
have to
got the
interject because, as you know, Germany is now trying to increase its coal production. What hope does that give you? This is one of the world's biggest economies and one of the most advanced as far as green technology is concerned.
Yeah, well, it's wildly infuriating, and we're seeing pictures right now of young people, typically young people, being manhandled by German police as they desperately try to stop the extraction of more climate-destroying coal. It's not controversial to say that we must stop burning coal as soon as possible, not just the IPCC, but the International Energy Agency, the IEA, which was set up at the behest of fossil fuel companies. It's by far and away a climate radical. They've been completely clear for a number of years now. We must rapidly phase out coal. So the notion that we should be expanding coal production anywhere in the world, let alone Europe, there's recent plans for the development of a new coal mine in the United Kingdom. It makes no sense. It makes no climate sense, makes very little economic sense, and I can't see how it makes any political sense.
Right. Yeah, and Rupert, for those out there who are still skeptical, I'm going to ask you, I mean, what kind of extremes or other massive weather conditions might actually really convince them that we can't take any more steps back? Arguably, Germany cannot look at coal development, no matter what the energy crisis might be at this point, that there's nothing more we can afford to do if we're going to avoid the worst of this catastrophe.
People say this is an emergency, a climate and ecological emergency. But you know what? That actually understates the problem. An emergency is something where you can send the emergency services and deal with it. An emergency is something you can imagine ending. An emergency is a problem that can be solved. This is much more serious than that. This is a new condition that is going to define all of our lives for a long time to come. And until we get serious, really serious about facing it, we are nowhere. And we will only get serious when we admit fully the brutal reality that James, for example, has been unusual among climate scientists in admitting that 1.5 degrees, we're not going to stay below 1.5 degrees. That these kinds of weather extremes are going to go on getting worse for a very long time to come. That until we actually recognize that our governments have chronically failed us, we are nowhere. We cannot trust our governments to solve this, and nor can our demanding or begging of our governments that they do more be trusted to solve this, because that's been tried, right? Our children have been trying that, the Extinction Rebellion have been trying that. The next step has to be that we start to take leadership into our own hands and recognize the really brutal reality that so far all this additional renewable energy has been additional to the amount of fossil fuels that's being burned, which is not been going down. And until we start to admit that horrendous fact, we are nowhere.
I know, but I mean, what about the people that are still, they still don't really believe it? I mean, what will it take? Will we have to see, for example, Europe's water supply effectively disappear? Will we have to wait for those glaciers to melt before people have to start rationing their own water before they say, oh, okay, now I see how this makes my life worse?
There's none so blind as those who will not see. If you can't see it now, I'm just not interested in talking with you. And that's why for some years now, I haven't debated climate change deniers. They're increasingly irrelevant almost everywhere in the world, with the exception of some parts of America and regrettably some parts of Australia. Look, everybody knows, everybody can now see it with their own eyes. You'd only have to open your eyes to see it. And we have to start to take leadership on it ourselves from the ground up. What I say to people is start to organize where you are, start to organize to prepare for these climate disasters that are coming. and start to organize to reduce
Okay.
your own contributions to them. Organize your family, organize your
Okay.
community, organize your
Let
profession,
me
because we cannot leave it to our government.
Let me ask Peter, though, because, I mean, for those who don't even deny it but are just a bit indifferent, they might even say this is ironically, a blessing in disguise right now, because the need for fuel has decreased in Europe with these warmer temperatures. It's lessened the energy crisis caused by the conflict in Ukraine. Are people being given, a false sense of security or an unjustifiable way to really justify this continuing behavior of ours?
Well, I think there'll be a lot of people feeling some relief, actually. I don't know about false sense of security, because it was undermined because of the Ukrainian war. But the whole process of change is not just going to depend on us as individuals and communities and households. It is also going to depend on the world's finances and all the big companies who have to change now. And that is now happening at a rapidly increasing rates. 75% of the businesses in Australia are now committing to net zero, and the requirements for net zero are tightening up to get away with the greenwashing. There's a UN report on it. There's a new report from ISO that shows how to do it. And there is increasing national reports saying this is what you must do. And that requires no more new fossil fuel production and no offsets that are being put in there instead of getting rid of the fossil fuels.
Okay.
So that process is underway, and it is happening at an accelerated rate. So we can see little bits that can encourage us to say, let's keep this moving, but let's not get...
A little bit of light at the end of the tunnel then for, the long-term mitigation, Peter. But, in the immediate term, you actually believe, if I'm not misunderstanding you, you said before that some irreversible damage is already being done as we speak to our biodiversity. That we're not going to get back. Explain how detrimental that really is.
Well, it's tragic, and if we continue on with this process, we will go past the 1.5. There's not much doubt about that. And the modelers say, oh, but we'll be able to get it back down again later. But in that process, we've lost a whole lot of biodiversity that cannot make the changes. So that's the problem we have. It is a deep issue in terms of our natural systems and the biodiversity that depends on them. So we're not just doing it for our own civilization's sake, and that's a pretty big one, and we are also doing it for the nature of the world.
Right. And James,
and it's also about if you really believe or not that we are going to get those temperatures back down again. Because I personally don't. I think that when they go up, they don't come back down again, partly for the reason that James indicated earlier, that we are now starting to set off feedback loops, tipping points. Those are almost certainly, in my view, going to make it impossible for us to come back down again later by these magical machines. They're going to allegedly suck loads of carbon out of the atmosphere. Once again, we have to be very careful not to mislead people here and enable people to be complacent. We are in absolutely desperate trouble.
Right. James, we've always, as humans, been able to kind of engineer our way out of most any major problem we've had at whatever cost. But when we're looking at climate change and we're looking at how we can mitigate the damage to ourselves, if it gets hotter, we just prop up the air conditioning and we use more of our fossil fuels to mitigate the damage to our personal lives. So, that's an indication as well that there kind of is no way out of this because of how we have to behave.
Yeah, I am very skeptical about our ability to reduce future temperatures through carbon removal. That's what we're on the route towards. What we are signing ourselves up to, well, I say ourselves, it's really our children and our grandchildren, is we're going to overshoot 1.5 degrees Celsius, and then the deployment of carbon removal technologies will drag concentrations back down and therefore drag temperatures back down. So by the end of this century, we would end up back at 1.5 degrees Celsius. In summary, I think that's a an incredibly reckless gamble that we're making, because if these machines don't work, if these technologies don't materialize, and let's be clear about it, they don't exist anything like its scale that we need them to, then we really are baking in temperatures going north of 1.5, maybe even 2 degrees. In fact, we seem to be on a trajectory towards 3 degrees Celsius.
Okay.
And we can't begin to imagine the impact that's going to have on not just the most vulnerable people to climate change, but those people, you, me, who live in the, let's say, relatively affluent and developed world.
Okay, James, I'm going to have to interrupt it there. That's going to have to be the final word, unfortunately, for this edition of The Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with us. Our viewers, of course, for tuning in as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.